the out-of-the-box thinking, like I want that more than almost anything else. That's my sort of pitch for why I'm kind of doing some of this stuff with AVMA is like, how do I connect us to the greater profession? It's important for me to think about the people that aren't in the room as much as the people that are in the room.
Welcome to Vet Life Reimagined. I love finding fellow veterinary professionals who've created their own unique paths by weaving together different passions and interests. And that's exactly who we have with us today, Dr. Jennifer Quammen. Jen has such an interesting story. She started as a vet tech and then became a veterinarian. And thanks to a simple nudge from a colleague, she found herself on a journey she never would have imagined. Currently, she's juggling life as a practicing veterinarian while also serving as Chief Veterinary Officer at Otto, which helps clinics transform their workflows with digital solutions. On top of that, she's just wrapped up her role as Vice President of the AVMA, where she was an advocate for veterinary students and faculty. During our chat today, Jennifer opens up about her AVMA experience, why having different voices at the table matters, and how to build a network of support we all need. We also dig into the changing landscape of our profession. Her passion for making our profession better is contagious, which is why I'm excited that she's running for AVMA President-Elect this year in 2025. So let's get to the conversation with Dr. Jennifer Quammen. When did you know you were interested in working with animals?
Oh gosh, this is the way we always think about this. Like, how did we get here, right? I think I'm one of those sort of classic individuals who was always very drawn to animals. You know, the positive side of that is like, oh yeah, animals are so fun and there's so many cool things and like they have this unconditional love that they offer. There is always that sort of yin and the yang to that of like, there's some pathology in life that sort of pushes you towards relationships that are not as potentially toxic. Like a human-to-human relationship can have some bad things. And that human-to-animal relationship rarely has that, at least in my experience. And so those, from a personal standpoint, were one of those things that really not only attracted me, but probably kept me connected to that over the years. And so I love being able to be the voice for the voiceless, you know, as many of us do.
Yeah. And if I'm correct, your journey into veterinary medicine was through being a veterinary technician. So how did you discover that veterinary technician was a career path and start getting into that?
Yeah, I thank you for the opportunity to talk a bit about that. And so for me, I think I thought from a young age that I might become a veterinarian, and just the way the cards deal in life, that just didn't become an immediate opportunity for me. And so this path towards becoming a technician suited my life better at that point, much more attainable. And it was something that I really enjoyed. And I still tease now, like, I was a really good technician. I think I'm an okay doctor. I mean, I think maybe a little better than okay. But there are some parts of that job that I still miss, right? Like it's a different side of your brain and your body that you're using. But I do think it was kind of my sort of initial foray into really getting more formally involved in the profession. You know, I can probably, like many, remember the first veterinary practice that I visited that really made an impact on me. As a kid, I had a very close relationship with someone who owned a practice, and I got to visit his practice, see the house cats that lived there, right? And sort of have that relationship to that place that I thought, well, this would be a really cool setting to work in. And so then you fast forward, you know, a decade or two or so, and you wind up in that scenario of actually working with those animals. And it's very different, obviously, to having a pet than working on them. But that was probably my initial, like, if I look back now, like, oh yeah, I can remember those little flashes in life of when you sort of connected with animals, but with animals in that more medical setting as well.
And I think that as a vet tech, you worked in like specialty and ER settings as well, which also gives you a unique perspective of veterinary medicine. So what did you find that you were liking in those settings?
Yeah, so as a veterinary technician, you get to do a lot of, obviously, the hands-on technical things. And so I worked in a mixed practice, I worked for a surgeon, and I worked ER. And I think the ER and surgery side were the pieces that I enjoyed the most as a technician, because you got to do the most advanced and more challenging procedures. Now, the challenge of that is those patients don't always have the greatest outcomes, right? You're dealing with really stressed out animals and really stressed out people in some of those settings. But it got to really push your skill set to a different level. And so I think for me, those are pieces that I did enjoy, is kind of pushing myself a little bit to, like, not to say there's not value in communicating day to day with a pet owner about wellness and vaccinations and all those things that we do on the day-to-day. But for me, I enjoy surgery. I enjoyed seeing that. Probably, I guess you could think of it as like the immediate gratification of like problem solution, right? And so there's that issue of like, okay, here's the thing in front of us. We've diagnosed it, we've done the thing, we've made it better, and now we can sort of move on. So I did enjoy that. Different than some folks that really love that development of a relationship and that long term, seeing that patient through its whole life. I love that as well. But if I had to pick and choose, I like those little snippets maybe a little bit more, if that makes sense.
I hear that from surgeons a lot. Is the very quick solution to the problem is enjoyable, and the reason why I wanted to emphasize that too is I think that says a lot on what you decide to do as a veterinarian as well. But so, I know your bachelor's degree, you're interested in, you did math and biology, so kind of true to this profession. But when did you decide to, okay, I actually want to try to apply for vet school?
Yeah, I think so. When I finally went back and kind of finished up my bachelor's, so I'd but been a technician, been working, and I went back and initially was like, I'm going to go whole hog on this math degree. And I really did enjoy it. And I added on biology a little bit as like, I don't want to say a side note, but it was kind of like, maybe not the first, it was kind of the second entry point. And so throughout my undergrad, I had a really great opportunity to do a lot of research. And so I did research from the mathematical side, working as a student statistical consultant. And then on the biology side, I did some field work. And so I worked on amphibians. And as a numbers nerd, the good news about amphibians is they have giant clutches of eggs, right? And so if you want to talk about numbers and getting stats, like frogs are great in that regard. And so I initially, when I left undergrad, actually went into a PhD program. And that was where my brain was headed. It was into this organismal biology. And I was in a great lab. We were working on temperature-dependent sex determination in turtles. Some people are probably familiar that like the temperature they incubate at sort of reveals what that animal is going to become. And the lab was great. And I just still had this yearning of there's something about vet med that was just sort of calling me back. And so I wound up applying while I was actually in my PhD program, got in, and ended up leaving a PhD program to go to veterinary school, which, is maybe not the story that most people would have, but it's how I sort of got there. And I'm glad I did it, but it's probably not the journey that most folks had.
Well, I mean, like I often say, as soon as you know where the path really needs to be, don't wait to get on it. You've made that discovery, so, choose the best next step for your futures. And I think you got into the Ohio State is where you chose to go. And for some people who maybe not know, for Kentucky, there's not a vet school, at least yet. Does the Ohio State have seats for Kentucky resident?
Yeah, so I actually wasn't, long sidebar, but I wasn't living in Kentucky at that point.
Okay.
But, this is the way the world works. There was a time when Kentucky actually did have seats at Ohio State. Most Kentucky students that are considering veterinary school, we have seats for in-state students at Auburn and Tuskegee both each class. And so that is where a grand majority of Kentucky-based students go to school. My path to Ohio State, like most of my things in life, was a little bit circuitous, but that's where I wound up. And I had a really great time, interesting program. I mean, I am not the person, to be fair, and this sounds terrible if some of you are veterinary students or contemplating veterinary school and thinking about this. I was not the person that was like, veterinary school was like the most life-altering experience of my life. I'm not that person. I have friends that are like, that is where I developed my most intense relationships. And yes, I have a handful of folks there. It just for whatever reason was not that for me. Maybe it was that I was a little bit older student at that point. Whatever the case might be, I don't think that's any knock on the program. It's just for me as an individual. I have a cohort of people that, I'm connected to, but I don't think like, oh, that was the life-altering relationships of my time. I don't know what your experience was like when you were in vet school.
Actually.
But for some folks, it was like, I love it, I love it, I love it. I'm so engaged. And I was like, okay, I like it, all right. I don't know if that's a bad thing to say, but that's kind of where my brain was.
No, I think, so let's keep going there. I think as long as you have some type of support system, right, and some type of network, that's great. No, my experience was similar to you. I honestly, vet school was the hardest 4 years of my life. I didn't That was not the best 4 years. And no, I didn't. Maybe I should have, but I did not build strong connections. I had a great vet school class. We worked well together. There was not a huge competitive feeling. Like, I feel very fortunate to have that class, but I don't have like best friends in that class, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I totally understand. So, I mean, and I know you also did I think a master's of public health at the same time. So, I mean, and I think you're working at the same time. I'm not sure. You're very talented. But like, who were your mentors at that time? Like, who did you kind of go to for maybe guidance, questions, just, general life support?
Yeah, I think the general life support certainly came from friends and family. And for me, and I think that is true when I was a veterinary student, I think that's true as a veterinarian, that like my cohort of friends and family this sounds so terrible, but they're not just folks in the veterinary space. And what I mean by that is like, you know how it is. You go to a party and someone introduces you, you sit on a plane and someone's like, what do you do? And I'm like, oh, how do I answer this? And so then it's like immediately like you're working, right? And so for me, I had a lot of relationships outside of just the profession. And I think this profession touches everyone in some way. But I think my siblings certainly were a big cohort for me. I think the folks that I had done my undergrad research with, like my primary faculty member for my undergraduate institution, he and I still connect. Our families see each other at holidays. And, this is 20 something years later. And, it's really cool that like we got to go on these experiences, and there were other students in my lab as well. And, we traveled within the country. We also went and did some international travel. And so I got to present undergraduate research with right next to master's and PhD students outside of this country. And so like, this is the kind of thing that like I got to do as an undergrad. And so I think those were folks that I really connected with. Had I not had that, maybe that would have been my vet school classmates that had become that. And I mean, no disrespect, but I was also, to your point, I was working, I was doing other stuff. And so I did not dive in on a bunch of different groups and clubs in vet school. I think I belonged to 2 clubs, and most schools have 30, 40 clubs now, right? But I had this big network outside of that I still lean on today.
And actually, as I was saying before we hit record, and I was listening to some other podcasts you've been on, one of the frequent ones you talked about with your husband, and we'll get there, but the coaching side of things, you talked about you're the most like the 5 people you spend the most time with, and having different categories of people that are your people. And there's, there's colleagues, and then there's family, and there's, significant others. And I think that is important to have a well-rounded network of support, because then they get all sides of you, and it's not one, which makes us unbalanced.
Yeah, and none of us are just one thing, right? Like we are all an amalgamation of all the things that life has brought to us. And so, yeah, my relationship with Ryan is different than my relationship to other people. And I think he brings out a different conversation in me than others do, and challenges me in some ways to have to think about it like, don't talk to me like you're talking to another vet. I need you to talk to me like a different perspective. And I'm like, okay, great. And that's good skill set, because I think that helps me continue to hone that school. And not to say that Ryan is like my average client, but that helps me to continue when I'm talking to clients. Like, yes, I could talk in doctor medical language all day long. That's not the thing that's going to connect a client to me and to get that patient the care that it ultimately needs. Those kind of things matter to me, of connecting with people. And I think that is much more valuable to me, really thinking about my network of folks, than it is to just say, oh, well, I went here for vet school and I did this and that. It's like, those are things that happen to me, but they don't make me who I am.
Well, and I think back to what we were talking about with you starting as a technician, getting that unique perspective of multiple, all I can think of is perspective, points of view.
Yeah,
right. That kind of complete the picture. That's so important. And you also, after vet school, I think you went back to one of the practices you had been a vet tech at. So what was that experience going from vet tech, disappearing for vet school? Well, you worked a little bit, but then coming back,
but mostly disappearing. Yeah.
But, now coming back, doctor, what was your experience like?
Yeah, that practice is wonderful and like still exists to this day. It's obviously changed a little bit, but there is an opportunity. And I actually thought about this. I was just giving an introduction of myself to someone a couple weeks ago, and I said, it's really an interesting situation to go into a practice as a new veterinarian of a place that already knows you. And they knew me as Technician Jen. The values of this practice were such that, we had about, I think around at that time, maybe 7 full-time equivalent doctors, 2 locations, mixed animal practice, had been around since the early 60s. So this place had almost 50 years of history when I walked in the door. And I think I was maybe, 1 or 2 of the women who had been hired there to do mixed animal work at that point. So there's already some things you're kind of coming up against. But the values of this practice, and again, this is not a place that's going to wave a flag and tell you this. No one says you have to call me Dr. So-and-so. It doesn't matter where the idea or the response or the thought of like, how do we approach this patient came from. It could come from the custodial staff, and that would have been totally fine. And so I feel like there was a very level playing field of a conversation I could have with folks. Now, did I put the pressure on myself that I need to think about things differently and I can't just fall back into being Technician Jen and placing the catheter? Yes. And so I still do it to this day. I will say, hey, here are the things I need to have done with this patient. And then I need to walk away because I think I can make people a little anxious, right? Like I'm ready to go. And I don't think I'm doing that in any way that's charging people like we got to do this now. I just think there is a little added pressure to you being in the room. And so I will just take myself out of the room. I'm not driving away, just going to the other room. Come find me if you need me. And so that allows me to walk away and not be fidgety and not have to like sit on my hands. Like, come on, you could have gotten that already, right? Like we can all do that. We can micromanage it that way. And it gives me the physical space to take the breath, think about it, let this person learn. We all need to struggle and learn and fail. Like that's what we're all doing in life. And so that I think is a skill I learned by jumping into that practice then. And it's something I still use now. And so I'm going to take this on a slight sidebar, if that's okay for a second. Of course. When I was getting ready to graduate veterinary school, we had an opportunity. Each university at that point had an opportunity to send students to the Veterinary Leadership Experience, the VLE,
oh, yeah,
which people are probably familiar with. And so every school chooses how those students go differently. And at Ohio State, we had to write an essay and say where we wanted to go. Now, traditionally, it's second-year summer students or third-year summer students that go. I went during my clinical year, and so I actually ended up having to leave VLE early to go to commencement. So I went literally right before I graduated, and I have looked back at that letter that I wrote. And part of that letter I wrote, and I said, look, I'm going into the same practice where I have worked for a number of years, and they know me as this, and I want to show up like this, and how do I help myself learn those techniques? And so I really do think, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, right? Like I didn't say anything quite that eloquent, but my being chosen to go to VLE and not only the experience of the process of that, but the relationships I made there really opened my eyes to what this could be. There are folks that I've met there that I literally still talk to every single week. And I've gone back to VLE and to VLI as a facilitator, I think 9 times. So I tease that I'm sort of like remedial, like it's a little bit of a joke, right? But I have a really strong passion for what that process can look like for you if you're open to that learning. And so for those that aren't familiar, this is all about learning about yourself, how you show up in the world, how you interact with others. And so I can now zoom in and zoom out and say, if I look at the letter I wrote as a student to say, this is why I want to go to this thing. And however the stars aligned that I got chosen and I went, and the people I ended up meeting there, and the skills that taught me to then be able to go into that practice and into future practices and into the boardrooms that I walk into now. Those are skills that I can't be thankful enough to have gained at just the right time for me.
Well, I mean, just listening to that, to me, it sounds, not only is it a very mature way of looking at it, but you were very clear on your goals for this event. And I think that's helpful for someone who wants to encourage that is already knowing how you're going to apply these things. You have a very clear situation. I want to be prepared going in, and I know that this experience will help me do that. And so you're going into the experience with your goals in mind. And it's just so wonderful that I've heard nothing but good things about the veterinary leadership experience. And so I'm glad that did set you up very quickly, because it does. When you were describing that moment of being in the clinic, you sounded very self-aware, right? And it'll be helpful too as you go through assessing all the different things that you're doing in your career, it's helpful to know who you are and what you value so you can make those decisions and quickly, just like you went from PhD program to vet school. So on that note, I mean, you do sound like a person that likes to do lots of different things. And so
That's fair. I think that's fair.
So what was the moment where you're like, okay, I may not want to do 100% clinical practice. I'm ready to explore.
Yeah, I don't know that. Well, I mean, maybe there was a moment, right? So I graduated veterinary school in 2011. And I think I mentioned I wasn't super involved in clubs and things as a student. The practice I went into really valued organized medicine. And so I got encouraged to go to one of our local VMA meetings and ended up within a few months of graduation actually having a seat on our state, on the Kentucky board, the Veterinary Medical Association board. And I was serving as like the constituent representation to the state board. And so 4 or 5 times a year, you would go and meet with all these folks from all across the state and like just learn about different things. And I really didn't know what the heck I was doing there, but I was learning, right? And learning on the fly a little bit. And one of the things that came out of that were opportunities to learn about other volunteer things that were out there. And so Kentucky and every state has these delegates to the AVMA. And so our delegate presented some volunteer opportunities that were available through the AVMA. And I heard one of them and I was like, this sounds kind of interesting to me. How do I learn more about this? And so I went to our delegate and said, hey, can you tell me more about this? And he said, I've not ever served on that council, but let me connect you with someone I know who's on there now. And so it was just through that conversation that I learned about that. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to put my hat in the ring and run for this thing. And I got it. And so the reason I bring that is because it was literally on a trip. So I served on this council for 6 years. And there were at that time 2 meetings a year. So you'd go up to Schaumburg, just outside of Chicago, to the AVMA. I call it the mothership, right? If it's this big AVMA headquarter building. And I would typically drive that. It's like a little over a 5-hour drive for me. I don't mind some windshield time. It's not a big deal. And so Ryan and I were actually on the drive back from one of those meetings. And it was a conversation of, well, I think I want to think about a different side of practice. I was getting involved in doing some more advanced surgeries, and I was thinking about kind of sports medicine or an Eastern-Western crossover of practice. Ryan was coming out of a physical injury. He's trained on the human side as an endurance coach. And so we were looking at things that we could each kind of do to kind of broaden our perspectives within our profession. And it was those back of the napkin conversation, if that makes sense, that was like, hey, I want to help people in this profession. You want to help people, and the skills that you have from coaching and executive coaching, why don't we apply those to, what we're doing in veterinary medicine? And so it was truly that conversation that then became the seed that grew into this business that we now have. And so do I think I made the decision that I'm leaving full-time practice 18 months after graduation? No. But did I have that conversation and just lean in enough? And we started speaking and we started building out and fleshing out this business and got a few clients. And I thought, okay, this is really cool. And so then I had to go to my owners and say, hey, I'm working at this practice. We take our own call. I love it, but I need a little bit less time on the floor. And I don't care where that is. You can put it at 2 p.m. for me. I'll come in early, take an extended lunch and work the night shift. I don't care what that looks like. I just needed a few more hours in my week to dedicate to this thing. And that ultimately was how it continued to grow. And I don't know that did I make the rational, intentional decision for that? I'm not sure, but it's clearly been a good choice for me. I don't think I set out to do that, but it is just those confluence of events of I wound up in this meeting in the Kentucky VMA, heard about this thing with the AVMA, got onto this thing with the AVMA, and then just on a random car ride, had this conversation about what would become our business, veterinarian coaching. And now we help literally hundreds of folks every year with different individual processes and things that they're going through. But it's been so cool, impact the profession in a really different way.
Those little did you know moments are kind of fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, and then I'm curious, maybe we should get Ryan on sometime, but what was his impression going from endurance athletes and CEOs and stuff like that? Mm-hmm. But how did he transition from that into, veterinary medicine?
Yeah, it's so interesting because he can bucket us all in one big pile, right? Like, you
Yeah.
veterinarians, you're all the same. And by that, he means technicians and PMs and everything as well. We're not, clearly. It's a little bit of a joke, but he was accustomed to working with folks that are like C-suite executives. So you have someone that's already working a 40, 50, maybe plus hour a week job. And on top of that, they want to run a triathlon or they want to do an ultra marathon. Like, these were the folks that he mostly worked with. And so he is really skilled at saying, okay, in your holistic look at your schedule, how do we get the training you need without overtraining or undertraining? And how do we get you to the target of where you need to go? And so I think that is the way he really works with veterinary professionals. And the other piece to that, I'll say, is that he's really adept at thinking about, and we think about veterinarians as mental athletes. We may not be pushing the physical limitations of things that we're doing with our physical training, but if you think about us holistically, if you are so stressed out and so overwhelmed by your day-to-day life that you can't be present with the patient in front of you, it's dangerous for the patient, it's dangerous for you, it's dangerous for the people around you. We do an inherently dangerous job. And you're not able to remember, take a breath, think about what you're doing before you go into that CPR. So when that thing comes, you can't access those places on your faculties because your prefrontal cortex is like offline. And so he's really adept at helping folks think about, let's back up and look at the human animal, if you will, because we're great at looking at the non-human animals as veterinary professionals. And so, so we really see veterinary professionals as like these mental and sometimes physical athletes. And so taking those principles from executive coaching and just putting those onto a different group of individuals with a slightly different framework.
Well, I just feel extra special all of a sudden because now I feel like an athlete.
Sure. Yes. Yes. I mean, think about it. Like, when the stressful thing is happening, it's like, do I remember the drugs? Do I remember the thing? It's like, you either get that moment, we all have it where everything just slows down for a second. And you're like, the thing you train for on the day to day is what you're going to fall back to. When the world is falling apart, your body goes to those things. And so that's where the coaching and training really is where we've figured out a niche for what we do.
And even having the very mental athlete aspect of things, but pairing that with the physical athlete. And I'm not saying everybody has to go run, try marathons, but just being able to take yourself out of that and focus on like being present in your body, doing something active, I'm sure is probably a unique thing too that he can also highlight and show the benefits of.
Yeah, 1,000%. And not that this is a promo for the coaching business, but like, we look at these different aspects and there are these different factors of well-being if you look at the way social scientists sort of talk about it. But it's like your physical well-being, your mental well-being, your social situation. What sort of support network do you have? And so for us, we talk to people about stress management and sleep hygiene. Like, if you're not sleeping well, and you have a young baby at home. I don't know how your sleep is right now.
Not great.
Yes, exactly. But so those are the kind of things that, like, what do you do when you know that time is coming where you're not going to get as much sleep? How do I then kind of push on other things to help maximize so that I'm not being so overwhelmed? Or what can I get rid of off of my plate in the short term so that I can still keep producing?
Well, and all of this time, I'll probably very sloppily ask this part of the question too, but I know for a long time you were also trying to understand telehealth too, and supporting companies that were trying to figure that out as well. How did that fit into all of this?
I am the Jill of all trades and master of none. I think officially, I think that's probably the nice way to say that is I tell people that I have a portfolio career.
Yeah.
Which doesn't mean that I can't sit still long enough. It just means I'm like a serial dabbler. I like a little of this and a little of that, and I've kind of cobbled together what works for me. I do work with a group. We've changed a little bit over the years. I could tell you our very first concept going back to like 2000, maybe 14, was quite different than what we're doing now. But we originally came out as a very much like telemedicine platform. And so talking to folks about how can, and I'll back up and say our clientele is veterinary practices. So we were not doing like direct to pet owner, like that's not our model. Our model is like, how do I facilitate a veterinary practice to do this should they choose? And so how do you help someone to charge for a virtual appointment, right? Like we think about that now, and in 2025, it's like, well, yeah, everybody does that. 8 or 10 years ago, that was not quite the case. And so I got involved with this group. And at that point, they were called TeleVet. We've now rebranded as Otto, OTTO. And we did, again, telemedicine for veterinary practices. How can I help you to do rechecks or to do derm appointments, or maybe some of those behavior rechecks? Or what does it look like for your practice to consider using some of this tool? And we were plugging along and doing okay. And then the pandemic hit. And in the background, we were sort of working on something else on the back end that became what it is today, which is a more complete suite of communication tools. And so Otto can enable you to share as much or as little with your clientele outside of your clinic walls, is how I like to think about it, without it being you on call all the time, right? So we have a lot of like automations, right? Hence the kind of cheekiness of the name. So you think about going and getting your haircut. I get an appointment reminder that I'm due for my haircut at whatever time. Same kind of concept here. You can do that with appointments. You can do that with, hey, I want you to fill out a survey and tell me what your experience was like. Hey, don't forget that you are on this prescription medication. The doctor sent home 4 weeks and it's now at week 3. And I want to nudge that client to say, are you ready to order some more? Those are the kind of things that we can help to enable veterinary practices to keep focusing on what matters to them. Do the medicine, do the human-animal relationship. That's what makes sense for us without us having to do as much of that administrative burden. And so I don't think it's ever going to be like, there's always this like, are you going to replace all of our staff? No, definitely not. But I hope I'm enabling your staff to actually sit and talk to that client so that they're not having to like try to talk to somebody at the front desk while the phone is ringing and while the text is going off and while there's a dog barking and, all those things. So yeah, so I think we're continuing to grow and develop. And this year we're doing some AI things in the artificial intelligence, not the therogenology AI. I always have to be conscientious about this in our space. But yeah, like I've been talking about AI for like 2.5 years, which is fascinating. Like there's people that are like, oh, I'm just learning about this. I'm like, let me help you. Let me help you make your practice life easier. And so those are the things that we get to do. And it's really cool to be in those conversations. Initially, it was in a very informal way. And then as the team grew, they were like, we really need someone. And so I serve as the Chief Veterinary Officer. So I get to be the veterinarian voice for a whole bunch of software engineers, for lack of a better description. We have a ton of folks that come from the veterinary space, but it's really interesting because they can make things really complicated. I'm like, no. I need you to make this like as simple as it can be. I need it to be that I could hand it to the kitten and the kitten could basically do it, right?
Yes.
We don't love tech changes a lot in VetNet. I don't know if you've noticed or not.
Yes, and you beat me to it. I was going to say the buzzword right now is AI.
AI. Yep, it's everywhere.
Yeah, well, and I can't help but just thinking about all the things that you're doing, and then I'll try not to put you on the spot too politically, but it's all these things were big points of discussion on an AVMA level, and so
sure.
So it's interesting that you have such a diverse background in all of these areas to bring these unique perspectives. Everything from telehealth way back from 2014. That's when I graduated vet school. So there's so much that changes, but it sounds like you've been right on it. This company's still been there, and serving the same audience. And I know some of the pushback with AI and technology is there's so many players coming into the space that don't know veterinary medicine, right? And so it is nice to, one, have a company that's been in vet med for a while, but two, know the value of having veterinarians or veterinary professionals as part of the team. And this is why it's so fun to see such diverse career paths, because we need representation on all of these aspects, I believe, to make vet med all that it can be.
Yeah, totally agreed. So I think for me, they talk about like, what's your superpower or what's your thing? And I think for me, my skill that I'm really good at is connecting folks. And so through all these different intricate relationships I have met so many people and had such cool opportunities to get to know folks. And I think, again, about those simple skills of like, when I meet someone, I literally probably don't know where they went to veterinary school, and I don't care, to be frank. Like, what bonds me to someone is finding something out about their family or the sport that they love or the food that they'll eat. What's your favorite flavor of ice cream, right? Like, those kind of things connect me to people. And so then you can have a genuine conversation. And what that means for me is you learn more about that person. And then when 6 months or 6 years down the road, someone says, hey, there's this thing. And I'm like, ooh, I am not the right person for this, but I know someone you should talk to. And so that for me is the place where I see myself right now, is in this ability to know enough to connect the right people, but also yet still be learning, like constantly learning. And I am still struggling with, how do we get more diverse perspectives into the room? How do we get more diverse representation? I think that is a challenge we're up against right now. I'm on my own journey of learning more about the DEIB space, and I've taken some of my own trainings, and I helped facilitate the AVMA Board of Directors for the 2 years I was on there, and we did the Journey for Teams activity. If you're not familiar with that, please find it out. It's open and available to all team members, and it is not behind the AVMA wall. That is open access to everyone, whether you're a member or not. But I would love for you to be a member if you're a veterinarian. A side note. And I think that helps me to understand, how can I perspective build? Because if that person is not in the room, I have a seat, or I had a seat for 2 years on that board table where I was representing over 20,000 veterinary students. Now, that is not a monolith. People will turn and say, well, what do the students think, Jen? And I'm like, well, it's hard for me to encapsulate 20,000 opinions into one, but here's what I see on the whole. And so that to me is that like environmental surveying of what's happening. And so I hope that I can continue, and I'm sure I will need to continue learning, but I hope I can continue to perspective take and bring that in. And one of my personal missions when I'm sitting in one of those boardrooms, and I do this with Otto and things as well, is I want to bring in the minority opinion. Maybe not because it's my opinion, but because I think we need to discuss it. Because I think if you're in a room where everybody is just yes, 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 all the way around, we're not making any progress. Like, we're just here in an echo chamber. And that doesn't mean that I want people battling, but I'm completely okay to agree to disagree. And I think about when I was on the Council on Vet Services, that group I told you that I applied for in the very beginning. And there was someone that was on the same exact 6 years that I was. And he and I differed strongly on our opinions on so many things in that room. But at the end of the day, when the meeting was over, we could go and sit and have a chat, have a coffee, have a beer, whatever, and have a really good relationship. And we've both changed over the years. And there are still a lot of things we disagree on, but I value the perspective he brings. And I think he values the perspective I bring. And I hope that I can continue to do that for others. And so that's my sort of pitch for why I'm kind of doing some of this stuff with AVMA, is like, how do I connect us to the greater profession? It's not an easy task, but I think it's at least what I'm driving towards right now. Sorry, I got a little bit like impassioned about that, but like, it's important for me to think about the people that aren't in the room as much as the people that are in the room.
Completely agree. And it's one of my passion areas too. My platform is a podcast, but we need people, especially I think, in places where decisions are being made. And sometimes it feels slow, but in government, which is also another thing that I think the more that we can learn about all of these different things, like the government, we understand why things take a long time, or things are the way they are. It doesn't mean that they're not going to change, but it helps us understand. And I think when you understand that different perspective, you problem solve better because you have more information. You have this new perspective. And so even if you are two colleagues that are disagreeing, like you said, as long as you keep bringing that perspective and you're both open to hearing it and considering it, I think that's, again, how we're going to bring the best solutions to these challenges that our profession faces.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the out-of-the-box thinking, like, I want that more than almost anything else. Like, I want someone to come to me and say, well, have you considered this? I'm like, oh, no, but like, I love this. Help me understand how we get there. Does that need to happen today? No. When I think about my life of living the organized medicine path with AVMA and living my life with a tech startup, boy, those are the yin and the yang of like, we can spin on a dime and spend a whole bunch of money and go off in a direction with a small-ish company and maybe going in the very wrong direction. AVMA, representing 108,000 members, having a staff of, triple digits, we're not going to spin on a dime, right? But there's going to be a lot of thought. And when those decisions are made, it's rare for AVMA to make a total miss in terms of a decision because there is a lot of thought behind it. Is it perfect? No, neither situation is. But that appeals to me as an individual that I can feed one side of my energy from this and another side of my energy from that. So it's pretty cool for me.
So being vice president of AVMA, your big responsibility is around understanding students and bringing that back. So I also feel like the past 2 years that you were vice president, that was a big year for education because we have a lot of conversations about starting new veterinary schools and thoughts around that. And are we in a potential shortage or are we not? Are we overcompensating? Like all of those questions have really been active over the past couple of years. And so when you go and hear the students and the academics, I'm assuming you're also talking to academics while you're at these universities too.
100%. Yes.
I mean, what were you seeing and hearing over those past 2 years? What's the sentiment? Where are you kind of hearing them?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And I think having the privilege, so as vice president, you oversee the SAVMA schools. So AVMA accredits all the schools in the US and then other schools as well. And so that is a slightly different pocket than what the VP represents. So the VP represents the SAVMA schools. There's 40 of those right now, 33 in the US, 3 in the Caribbean, 3 in the UK, and 1 in Canada.
Ooh.
And so those are the schools that are represented in the SAVMA or the Student House of Delegates. And you can oversee the national board, right? Like you help to oversee AVMA or national SAVMA leadership. So they're President-Elect. And they have their own sort of governance body. AVMA has something like that as well. They're slightly different in how they're run, and that's okay. And so in addition to visiting schools and interacting with doing lunch and learns and things with students and or with faculty was probably the big group for me to really learn a lot from. I went to some of the AAVMC meetings. And so the AAVMC, for those who aren't aware, is the alphabet soup that represents the administration and the deans of most of the veterinary schools, right? It's probably that's the best way I think I can encapsulate it. And so you're in those conversations. I don't think I went to any veterinary school, even 2 years ago. I don't think I went to a single school where someone said, I have more faculty than I know what to do with right now. Everyone needs faculty, period. Everyone needs faculty and staff. Specialists, I think, are really a unique scenario, and not every school having a teaching hospital. It's a slightly different mix of how many specialists they might have on staff, because if they're not at a tertiary teaching facility, that might look different if they're teaching in a more distributive or hybrid model. But students still need to have access to that, and there's still research they need to have access to. And so I think faculty are what I'm hearing, period. I think the post-COVID, do students come to class? Do students not come to class? That is definitely a conversation that people have strong opinions about. And I can be in the middle on this, right? If you're just lecturing off of PowerPoint slides, I totally understand the perspective of a student who wants to sit on their couch with their dog and watch it at 2x rather than sit there in class and watch it at 1x. I can see both sides of that. But I do think our students are having great conversations about what does this look like and where do I see myself in the future? So in terms of big themes, I think workforce in the academic institutions in particular. I think even 2 years ago, we had the U.S. schools alone being about 500 faculty short of what they need to be fully staffed. And we have, depending on the numbers, somewhere between a dozen and 15 additional veterinary schools coming online in the next few years. And so the volume of faculty is certainly a bit of a concern. That's something to be said for. Students are interested, students are engaged, they're high energy, they're doing all kinds of cool things. I think I never cease to be amazed by the creativity and the professionalism of someone. I'm like, at your age, I could barely tie my shoes is what I feel like, right? So to see them represent, but also it's a different life that they're bringing, right? They want to do things differently. And the students have their own conference every year, the SAVMA Symposium. And it's so cool to go and see the CE that they want to see and the wet labs that they want to do. And so I would just encourage folks to think about what does it look like to bring again those perspectives. And that was my job as the VP, was try to bring that voice of the faculty and the students to that table. And I don't do it alone, but that is it's a weighty job for sure. So great folks for sure.
Yeah. Well, what are you most excited for your personal future right now?
Oh gosh, boy, so many things. I mean, life is in a reasonably good place right now. As per usual, I have a few spinning plates. My current spinning plates, so I finished my term as vice president in June of 2024. I also announced my run for AVMA President-Elect. And so I'm currently a candidate. And so people all the time are like, what are you doing on the board? I'm like, I'm not on the board right now. I am currently an average AVMA member, just like you. And so I pay my dues the same as everyone else. AVMA staff members that are vets also pay their dues, by the way. I don't know if people think about that, but like all those staff members, they also pay their AVMA dues each year. And so the challenges right now are thinking about what's happening with Otto. And I have a great opportunity with a team there that I can work remote with them, right? Like that's the way I've been able to do that from the jump. I'm still doing clinical practice, and currently I've been able to do a little bit more than I was during my 2 years as VP. And as I make this run for president-elect, and for those that don't know, AVMA elects a new president-elect every convention in the summer, and every other year we elect a new vice president. So this past summer we elected a vice president, and since it's a 2-year term, we won't do that this year, but we will elect in July of 2025 AVMA's next president-elect. I really hope that is me. And the things that I'm thinking about through this time are, who do I interact with and how do I get my voice out there? And so I have been doing a lot of blogging, which I never thought I would do. I'm not great at sitting down and writing. I tend to be a little bit more active that way, if you hadn't figured that out. And so part of the reason I'm doing that is to share some of this journey, because I want to make this an opportunity for me to look back on this year and say, look what I did and look what I was able to share. And I want to be the sort of what I've called the softer side of AVMA, if that makes sense. Like, I think AVMA could be seen as this very formal, very stiff group. And I think there are pockets that way, but I think on the whole, it's not really that way. And if you just like peek behind the curtain a little bit, you might know that. And so I want to be the ability for people to just open the aperture just a little bit and look in at what AVMA is doing, because I hear all the time, I wish AVMA did X, or I wish they had this resource. And I'm like, by the way, they already have that. You just didn't know where to find it, right? Or help me, we didn't advertise it well enough, whatever that might be. And so my mission throughout this year has been to share the things that matter to me in terms of going in as potentially president-elect, but also to share a lot of the values that are out there that AVMA already puts out, to just share those with a broader audience. You know, the job of the president-elect is to be, in my opinion, the chief communicator for the profession. You are speaking at different state organizations. You are speaking on an international level. You're traveling on an international level, and you are representing the veterinary medicine of mostly of the US on a grand stage. And so to me, I think I'm pretty good at being able to, again, perspective take for others, to mostly stay on point. Don't give me a speech that's written word for word. Give me bullet points, and I'm better that way. And I think that I can be an open, fairly clear communicator. Maybe I'll listen to this podcast and think differently about that. But those are things that I see that I can bring a level of enthusiasm, a level of confidence. I think I represent a lot of what our organization looks like right now. And however this works out for me, win or not win, I'm going to have had fun. And I hope that someone else will look at this journey I'm on and say, that could be me. That's the mission that I've taken with this. So that's where I'm at, is working for Otto and playing this wonderful game of trying to get elected as president-elect of the AVMA, which is a very interesting game.
I can only imagine. And
Yes.
I just want to say that your ability to communicate and speak has been seen. It must be good, because that is how we got connected. Was I saw that Josh Baseman was singing your praises at hearing you give a talk. So you seem to be on a good track. And I hold Josh's opinion very highly. So he's
Absolutely the same.
Yeah.
Yes. And I remember the first time I met Josh, and I think that was the conference that he mentioned. And I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't know he knew who I was. So I had a definitive fangirl moment there. So if you've not gone out and read his book, folks, do it. Lead to Thrive. It's quite good.
And I always love to end. What is something that you are really grateful for right now?
Awesome. Oh gosh, there's so many things. I am in the moment. life throws interesting challenges your ways, right? So I am currently super thankful that I have family that is close enough to be huggable right now. My younger sister and I are very connected, and she's a vocalist in the Air Force Band. And so her job is to sing. So she sings the national anthem as her job. Who knew that was a thing? And she has been stationed for the last 4 years in Japan. And she just moved back to the States in December. And so she will be at my house in, I think, about the next 30 minutes. And so she's only a few hours away now. And so although we saw each other through the last 4 years, I'm just really grateful for proximity to family, I think is what I'm going to lean into with that right now.